This is the story of a revolution. A revolution that turned a nation from its blood-soaked and warlike past into a culture pursuing spiritual knowledge and inner peace. It is the story of an ancient prince who became a god, inspiring a line of divine kings who still govern and guide through teachings of love and compassion. Hidden away for hundreds of years here at the top of the world, that civilization flourished, rich in its unique traditions and exotic culture. Only in this century has the veil of secrecy and mystery been lifted. And it is the story of a small peasant boy who became the last god king in the land of snows. Born to rule the hermit kingdom, he would instead witness the destruction of one of the world's most ancient cultures. This is Tibet and the End of Time, our last lost civilization.
It was 1978, so I was like 29 years old. I had gone to India and Nepal for the first time, and when I was in Nepal, I had met Tibetan refugees. And it was the first time that I was aware of what had happened to the Tibetans. And they really were these otherworldly creatures. They seemed to be able to see right through you. And their whole reality structure, the fabric of it, was of a different cut than mine. Although I couldn't communicate well with them, it was clear that there had been a major tragedy here. As I left there, I started to read more about the Tibetan situation, and I realized what a horror, in fact, had occurred, and the almost total destruction of a people overnight. The rest of the world knew nothing about.
We are in India, at the western end of the Himalayas. Converging on this remote valley are pilgrims. They have crossed mountain passes of over 18,000 feet, the highest in the world. They come from local villages, neighboring valleys, and all over the world. They come here because they are Buddhists, followers of a 2,500-year-old religious tradition. It is an arduous journey, but each is determined to attend one of the most sacred of all Buddhist ceremonies. It is the Kala Chakra, which means the Wheel of Time. This week-long ritual prepares for the end of all things, the complete destruction of time and space. Buddhists believe the world is entering an apocalyptic age. All week, these monks will work day and night. They are heart surgeons, but their knowledge of the human heart is based not on medical science, but on love and compassion. They work not to save a single patient, but to heal the heart of a world in crisis, to deliver every living being from samsara, the cycle of birth, life, death, and rebirth, the world of pain. With meticulous care, using grains of colored sand, they create an intricate pattern called the mandala. It's a kind of map, guiding believers on the path to enlightenment, beyond the illusions of the material world, the world of things, to help them be reborn in a higher realm of spiritual truth. Presiding over the Kala Chakra is the man his disciples believe to be the incarnation of the Buddha himself, the Dalai Lama, the God King of Tibet. Today, like 150,000 other Tibetans, the Dalai Lama is a political refugee, an exile in neighboring India for nearly 40 years. The current Dalai Lama, a title meaning ocean of wisdom, is the supreme leader, both religious and political, of 6 million Tibetans. His followers believe that over the past 600 years he has died 13 times, on each occasion his soul returning in a new body or incarnation. The year is 1933. The 13th Dalai Lama has died. A team of Tibet's most respected monks will begin the search for his successor, for a child born with the same soul as each deceased Dalai Lama. They pray for his speedy return to this world. Their search parties spread out across the land. And Tibet is a vast land. It is equal in size to Western Europe or to Alaska and Texas combined. For millennia, it has remained remote and undisturbed behind the seemingly impenetrable walls of the Himalayan plateau. The largest landmass on Earth, with mountains the highest in the world, that rise 5 miles into the sky. Always a place of mystery, Tibet was the model for Shangri-La, the land of abominable snowmen, strange rituals, and magical rites. A world of levitating mystics and of monks whose souls could leave their bodies and fly to mythic kingdoms. (1937). 4 years after the death of the 13th Dalai Lama, and still the monks chant and pray for the success of their search, for the discovery of the next God King of Tibet. They have traveled to the far reaches of this desolate wilderness, weeks turning into months, months becoming years. Tibetans believe that every living being has but one soul, and that this essence passes like a flame from one body to the next in the continuous cycle of birth, death, and rebirth. The actions of the soul in one life determine the body it enters next. An evil person may be reborn as a lowly animal, while a good soul might return as royalty. Purified by the good deeds of countless past lives, a soul attains enlightenment, a kind of divinity known as nirvana, where the soul is set free from the material world. Highest ranking among the enlightened ones is the Dalai Lama. Tibetans believe he returns to the world out of compassion to help others toward enlightenment. Several auspicious signs lead the monks to believe Tibet's eastern province of Amdo was the site of the Dalai Lama's return. It is said that days after his death, the head of the 13th Dalai Lama turned in that direction, indicating where to search. An image of a monastery with a distinctive turquoise roof appears reflected in the waters of a holy lake. The search party knows it is drawing close. A series of rainbows appear in the cloudless sky. Rumors reach them of a boy born on July 6, 1935, shortly after the 13th Dalai Lama's death. Horns were heard in the heavens on the day of his birth, and the boy, it is said, often speaks of his home in Lhasa, Tibet's far-off capital, a place he has never even seen. His name is Lamo Dundup. Immediately, he identifies one of the search party by name, speaking in the man's own dialect. He then reaches up and pulls at the monk's prayer beads, beads that once belonged to the 13th Dalai Lama. But one final test awaits young Lamo Dundup. Arrayed on a table before him are many objects. Among them, a few of the previous Dalai Lama's personal possessions. The boy selects these and none other. For the monks, it is as if the Dalai Lama has simply reclaimed what was his. Their long search is over. Lamo Dundup is renamed Tenzin Gyatso and prepares to become the 14th Dalai Lama. The year is 1940. Lhasa, the capital of Tibet, prepares for the enthronement of its new god king. These watercolors were commissioned by Sir Basil Gould, the only representative of a Western government to witness this most sacred of ceremonies. They offer an intimate record of a culture that no longer exists, some of the last images of the world's only theocratic civilization, a society ruled by the priesthood, as it celebrates the enthronement of its supreme ruler, both spiritual and secular. The son of a mule driver from Tibet's most remote eastern province, young Lamo Dundup has come a long way from the two-room shack he shared with his parents and 4 brothers and sisters to this magnificent temple. 7 stories high with over 1,000 treasure-filled rooms, this is the Potala, the great winter palace of Lhasa. But this is no ordinary tale of rags to riches, nor would there be a fairy tale ending. Walking through the vast halls and cavernous prayer rooms of the Potala, past statues of Tibetan saints and Buddhist masters, beneath shrines containing the mortal remains of his 13 previous incarnations, the young Dalai Lama bears the weight of an age-old tradition on his slight shoulders. Constantly reminded of his place at the heart of Tibetan civilization, he is now the torchbearer of a religion stretching back 2,500 years. The origins of Buddhism take us back to the year 600 BC to the plains of northeast India. Here, an event occurred as momentous for Buddhists as the birth of Jesus Christ is for Christians. 2,500 years ago, an Indian prince sat beneath a sacred tree. He had spent many lifetimes in search of the truth and now vowed not to rise again until he had solved the mystery of existence. Immersed in deep meditation, he was to conquer all the dark forces of delusion. As Venus rose in the morning sky, he was rewarded for his age-long patience. Touching the ground, he called upon the earth to witness the sacred moment of his enlightenment. His name was Buddha. He had unlocked, he said, the very meaning of life. All beings, he taught, were caught up in samsara, the cycle of birth, death, and rebirth. Samsara could only be escaped through the spiritual fulfillment he called nirvana. While all souls climb life's ladder to enlightenment, achieving nirvana takes countless lifetimes. Enlightenment only comes when the true nature of reality is grasped. Existence is impermanence. The Buddhist philosophy is contained in 108 volumes that many followers learn by heart. It would take 1,500 years for Buddhism to migrate from the hot, dusty plains of India into the Himalayan mountains where it would finally take root, here on the roof of the world. The Tibetan Plateau is one of the most remote, inhospitable places on Earth, an unlikely setting for a faith based on love and compassion to survive, and yet it flourished. Why? Perhaps the harshness of the setting provides a clue. Here at 18,000 feet on the vast, desolate Himalayan plateau, people are naturally humbled by the forces of nature. As nomads, they lead lives of change and impermanence, and need only look around to sense their place in life's larger scheme.
Of course, the terrain, to a certain extent, is so impressive. It so dominates everything in your life. One gets a fairly good grasp on the limitations of one's own identity and one's ego, which is a good help when one has to move to new places and adjust. 60% of Tibetans are nomads. One of the most important factors that contribute to Tibetan resilience and his ability to adapt to fresh environment is, I think, a philosophical one. It's the idea of impermanence. This is taught to you all the time. It's hammered into you. Children, in our culture, in our folk culture, in our songs, even in our just daily expressions, that all is impermanence. It's mitakpa. Comes and goes. Suffering is impermanence. Happiness is impermanence. I say a Tibetan straight from the northern plains, a nomad from the Changtang, goes to New York. Of course, he's impressed with Western technology and even with Empire State Building. But he's not that impressed. He knows at the end of the day that one day, that's also impermanent. So it doesn't traumatize him. It doesn't impress him unduly to a point that he feels that he is nothing, he is small.
The Buddhist belief in impermanence and the end of all things is balanced by an equally strong belief in rebirth and renewal. An important visitor has arrived at this nomad's campsite, a reincarnate High Lama, or Rinpoche as they are known. It is a time of excitement and great honor. All day, nomads visit the Lama's tent, presenting katas, the white scarves of respect. Young and old alike have come, seeking his blessing. That the Rinpoche is only a small child is not important. For these nomads, this boy is the heir to many lifetimes of spiritual power and wisdom. In the 1930s and 40s, there were reckoned to be between 5,000 and 6,000 such lamas in Tibet. Here in this rugged yet breathtaking landscape, the Buddhist notions of beginninglessness, endlessness, the loss of ego, reincarnation, and impermanence are no longer abstract concepts. They are day-to-day realities. In a valley below, at a mere 12,000 feet, the Kalachakra is in its fourth day. The Himalayan sun is intense. Speaking to a crowd of 40,000 followers, the Dalai Lama delivers the Buddhist message of impermanence, a lesson that has given the Tibetan people the strength and resolve to cope with tragedy and change. It has given them the ability to remain hopeful, even when they appear to have lost everything. This brave outward face conceals the depths of Tibet's despair. In the past, the Kalachakra was celebrated only once every 20 years or so. Today, the wheel of time turns faster. The ceremony is performed annually. It is Tibet's way of addressing a crisis that has brought its civilization to the brink. In the 7th century, when the Buddha's message of love and compassion first reached Tibet, the people here were as savage and hostile as the landscape itself. From early records of the Chinese Tang dynasty come the first outside views of Tibet, a portrait very much at odds with the peaceful society that would evolve here.
There are hundreds and thousands of men ready to bear arms. In order to levy troops, they use a golden arrow. Their bow and their sword never leave them. They prize physical strength and despise old age. Military discipline is strict. In battle, it is not until the troops in front have been completely wiped out that the troops behind come up into line. They prize death in battle and hate to end their lives by sickness. As punishment, even for a small fault, they take out the eyes or cut off the feet or the nose. They give floggings with leather whips just as they see fit.
Tibet was a feared conqueror in Asia. They toppled the Tang dynasties, took its capital several times. They conquered into the different Indian dynasties. They conquered the Silk Route cities. They smashed the Caliph of Baghdad in a couple of battles. They were a very tough group, like Genghis Khan in the first millennium, sort of.
With China and Burma to the east, India to the south, Russia to the north, and the Arabic empires to the west, Tibet's military expansion was by all accounts formidable.
After 1,000 years, they achieved something by the 17th century, which I think will lead them to be evaluated as one of the greatest civilizations of this day. They basically demilitarized.
Reminders of their warlike past can still be found in Tibet's national sports of polo and archery. But this was not the direction the civilization chose to take.
Tibet was unique on the planet. No other country changed in the same way that Tibet did. All of the others really went in the opposite direction. Tibetan criterion of civilization is a nation that does not use violence, that solves disputes and dilemmas reasonably, with conversation with neighbors.
From the crumbling ruins of its aggressive past, monasteries sprung up across the land. Where there once were armies of soldiers, there were now legions of monks. By the late 17th century, Tibet's transformation was complete. Scythe replaced sword, temple replaced fortress. From the most unlikely beginnings, a peaceful, self-sufficient society emerged, dedicated exclusively to the pursuit of non-violence and spiritual wisdom.
He was a very gentle people who wanted nothing more than to evolve their wisdom civilization even further. There was no starvation in Tibet. People had what they needed to survive. In this lifetime, they were an aristocrat. Next one, they were a peasant. It wasn't that big of a deal. Hardships, to be sure, but every civilization has that. Inequities, to be sure, every civilization has that. But is it in a direction? You know, it was quite an extraordinary experiment that everyone was a part of. The experiment of Tibet, part of which was, and the central core of it being religion, of creating a society that's based on the ideals of a bodhisattva, of an enlightened one, of an altruistic one. A truly altruistic society whose institutions are formulated from the ideals of that enlightened individual. And that the institutions of that civilization are there to foster more of those people. We tend to do that the other way around in this country. We make institutions and conceptual frameworks and then try to fit people into them, rather than starting with the wonderful ideal and then have institutions and structures to create more of them or foster them or support them. But this experiment of Tibetan culture and civilization, what an extraordinary thing, based on total altruism. I do it for the other.
At the turn of the 20th century, there were over 6,000 monasteries in Tibet. A quarter of the population entered religious orders for a life of celibacy and spiritual devotion. It was a source of great pride for each family to have at least one son enter the priesthood, often before his 5th birthday. This was the world into which the 14th Dalai Lama was born.
They treated me just like another boy. So they often use it, defeat. So when we compete, I often defeat. So sometimes I feel so unhappy, sometimes I cry. But they, I said, they don't care who I am.
As the young Dalai Lama prepared to assume the mantle of Tibet's supreme spiritual leader, his training was rigorous, including logic, Tibetan art, medicine, poetry, and philosophy. He would memorize thousands of lines of Buddhist scripture and practice meditation 4 hours each day. 75% of Tibet's budget was spent on education for the priesthood and the maintenance of its religious institutions. Monasteries stood at the heart of Tibetan culture as both temples of worship and institutions of higher education. These were Tibet's Harvard and Yale, the great centers of learning that housed Tibet's vast libraries of knowledge, both spiritual and academic. Many thousands of Buddhist texts were translated. New discourses on medicine, astrology, and psychology were published, addressing the most complex issues of time and space. Yet for all their higher learning, Tibet had no mechanized presses. All printing was done with wooden blocks. Tibet challenges all conventional notions of modern civilization. Intellectually advanced, spiritually sophisticated, and yet, in so many aspects, undeniably primitive. In Tibet, even the wheel, that proverbial symbol of progress, was used primarily for religious ends. Prayer wheels, both small and immense, turn ceaselessly, containing hundreds of thousands of invocations, each revolution a sort of Buddhist Hail Mary.
Instead of guarding our borders, we devoted ourselves to teaching and learning. Instead of launching invasions, we built monasteries. We channeled the whole energy of our minds to the contemplation of compassion, impermanence, and the nature of life and death. So the same people who were ready to fight and die in wars now devoted themselves entirely to spiritual matters.
In many ways, Tenzin Gyatso's early life was similar to that of thousands of novices preparing for the priesthood, except in one essential detail. He was the 14th Dalai Lama, the new God King of Tibet. Unable to wander the streets of Lhasa like other boys his age, the young Dalai Lama would climb to the roof of the Potala with a telescope to look out onto the kingdom he was born to rule. Beyond the narrow streets of Lhasa, he could make out the beginnings of the other Tibet, the Tibet of great empty spaces, the Tibet of nomads and of traders. In the years before ocean travel, all trade with the Orient moved over land. The fabled silk routes ran from Venice to Peking, with caravans of camels carrying glass, furs, mirrors, red coral, salt, silks, spices, and carpets. Tibet stood at the crossroads of Central Asia, and Tibetans became accomplished traders, buying or selling anything of value. But the most important commodity Tibetans could trade was religion and the spiritual power of their priesthood.
For 800 years, Tibet did not rely on an army to protect itself. For 800 years, Tibet's territory, religion and culture were defended by spiritual means. Tibetan lamas and high priests became the most powerful and revered figures in Central Asia. The kings of neighboring countries, like the emperors of China and the Khans of Mongolia, became the disciples of Tibetan lamas, and in return, they met their promise to protect Tibet from invasion.
For centuries, Tibetans have been intrepid travelers, making journeys that required enormous courage and great endurance. But for Buddhists, the most important journey was the one they would make after death. We are near the border of India and Tibet. Buddhist monks lead mourners to a cremation. The corpse is bound in fetal position. Funeral rites differ, but death unites all cultures in the universal experience of grief. Cremation is only one way dead bodies are disposed of in Tibet. Another is called sky burial. The corpse of the deceased is taken to a special place, then hacked into pieces and left for the birds. In the West, this seems shocking. For the Tibetan Buddhists, it was the final act of charity, leaving one's now worthless material remains for the benefit of others. In this case, vultures. The week-long Kalachakra ceremony is nearly over. One ritual remains. The great mandala is now finished. For the 40,000 pilgrims here, there can be no greater privilege than viewing the Kalachakra mandala. They wait patiently in line. It will take days for them all to have their turn. But to attend this sacred teaching, to finally see the Kalachakra mandala, will be the culmination of their religious lives. Like gaining a seat on a spiritual lifeboat from this world to the next. To see this fabled wheel of time is the Buddhist equivalent of a pilgrimage to Mecca or an audience with the Pope. Every Buddhist spends a lifetime preparing for death. This is their way of accepting the impermanence of all things. In much the same way, Tibet over the years has always foreseen the inevitable destruction of its own civilization. Genocide would descend upon Shangri-La. A holocaust, breaking the peace and silence of a world that hardly knew the sound of a machine, let alone a machine gun. A country that had flourished undisturbed in a timeless corner of history was shaken into the present and awakened into its own worst nightmare. The year is 1949. China, the most populous nation on Earth, its massive army battle-hardened and equipped with the latest weapons of war, invades its defenseless neighbor. Citing long-standing territorial claims, the Chinese quickly conquer what they call the treasure house of the West. Over the years, Tibetan monks had successfully warded off Chinese aggression, trading spiritual power and blessings for peace and protection. But in the revolutionary fervor of China's new communist order, religion is considered a poison, and Tibet a backward, superstitious society in need of re-education. In 1933, 16 years before the Chinese invaded, the 13th Dalai Lama had foreseen the destruction of their unique and complex culture.
If we do not dare to protect our territory, our spiritual leaders may be exterminated without trace. The property and authority of our incarnate lamas and monks may be swept away. Our political system will vanish without anything remaining. The property of our people, high and low, will be seized and the people forced to be slaves. All living things will have to endure endless days of suffering and will be stricken with fear. Such a time will come.
After 10 years of Chinese occupation, the Dalai Lama decided he had no choice but to leave Tibet. In 1959, under cover of night, the Dalai Lama, his bodyguard and courtiers fled from the holy city to India, never to return. He was only 23 years old, yet he had already witnessed changes far greater than any Tibet had experienced in its long and peaceful history. 100,000 Tibetans would follow, seeking asylum in India, but leaving 1 million more who would die in the atrocities and famines to come.
Right at the moment, the knowledge of what actually happened to Tibet, our Tibetan version of the Holocaust, is extremely imprecise. It's not unlike the Nazis, the information we have on what happened to the Jews, all the death camps, we got it primarily after the war, when the Reich's archives could be opened and studied, when Allied soldiers visited the camps, when graves could be disinterred. But nothing of the sort has happened in Tibet.
Ani Pachen is now a Buddhist nun. Her father was the chieftain in Tibet's northeastern region of Ganzhou. After his death, she took over command of the local resistance unit and fought fiercely until her capture.
All those people who risked their lives to protect Tibet and our religion were killed or arrested. The monasteries were destroyed. Gold and silver statues were carted off to China. The monasteries were reduced to empty shells. I was beaten with sticks, but I had nothing to say. They said that our crimes would have to be confessed. We were tortured and suspended upside down from the ceiling. My legs were shackled for over a year. There was no food in my stomach. I had fallen unconscious from time to time. Some inmates told me that they even felt tempted to eat their own excrement. Such was the hunger in the prison. Now I am old. When I went into prison, I was just 25. When I came out, I was an old woman. I have spent my life in prison.
And it's an old-fashioned belief, but I believe that justice will out. And, we may get a moment in history when, in the future, I think the truth of Tibet and the terrible calamity it suffered. The numbers are very inexact now. They quote 1.2 million people, but the extent of the massacres, the killing, the starvation, the famine that took place in Tibet is a colossal one.
One way I feel very, very unlucky, very, very unfortunate, is it because I born at a period the Tibetan nation experienced most destructive experiences. However, you see, my determination is concerned, I never is shaken. It's my determination. I say whether achieve or not, I say it is worthwhile. Make every attempt. I say, so that even fail, I say there is no regret. In future, Tibet will be new Tibet, will never be old Tibet. And I mean, neither possible nor necessary. I'm quite sure we can survive, but this very much depends on Tibetan freedom. Some kind of genuine self-rule. If we achieve that through negotiation with China, I'm quite sure we can survive. Without that kind of freedom, without that kind of genuine self-rule, then Tibetan civilization is really now facing threat of extinction.
At the end of the day, a civilization rests on its own soil. Land is the primary requisite for civilization. And not just purely from a nationalistic, basic point of view, but land has mystique. It has a smell. It has 1,000,001 things that we cannot even begin to think of. We take it so much for granted when we have it. Tibetans need that land. As long as Tibetans, I think, remain true to the idea of getting their country back, of freeing their brethren inside Tibet, yes, I think our civilization is not lost at all.